We're pushing our way through part 3 of this over-the-top model kit build, the epic CHAPPiE MOOSE. We have a ton of painting and even more masking. Hopefully we can make this look good by the end of it, so let's go. Okay, last time you guys saw me struggle very hard trying to get this metallic gold paint to stick to these parts. After many coats and a lot of patience, I finally got it to come out somewhat decent, at least decent enough to move on, and I am excited about that. I am completely over painting things gold, and I was very relieved to know that I could at least move on for the time being to painting some matte finishes. Unlike metallic finishes, it is almost impossible to mess up a flat paint job. In the last episode, I went over why I wanted to paint a lot of the parts on this gold, and here I am doing the exact opposite, and I am juxtaposing that metallic finish with a very flat matte finish. I figured not only do you have the colors very different, but you have the surface finishes also very different. Because these contrasts are going to be right next to each other, it's actually going to make the extremes of them pop out even more. So the flat finishes and the darker colors are going to make the gold seem even shinier and brighter, and in contrast, the gold is going to make the flat colors look even more flat and darker. Because the gold is such a strong color, I wanted to go with a plethora of grays for the armor, and that was going to make it so it would not clash with that gold in any way. And with this hexagon stencil, I'm adding even more textural depth. If you remember from the last episode, I was having the hardest time with some very strange paint reactions with the gold I was trying to lay down. It turns out the problem wasn't because the parts were dirty or that they weren't primered or sanded. It had to do with the fact I was using an old can of gold paint. Yes, that simple. The part on the left is with a fresh can, and the part on the right is many coats, and if you look at it, it actually looks much more glossy. It's almost like that old paint can had way more gloss going on, and that just made all the difference in the world. The new can of gold not only went on so much smoother, but it also stuck to the parts a lot better. So learn from my mistakes. If your paint can is even slightly questionable, just go ahead and get yourself a new can. Trust me, it's worth it. At least for these metallic and more delicate kind of finishes, it is totally worth it. Just buy a new can. The old can wasn't even that old, maybe 6 months, maybe a year total, but it was still almost a full can, and I have reused cans that were way older with just fine results. Maybe it's because it was gold, I'm not sure, but had I known this before, I would have started with a very fresh can. And next up is the second most tedious part of this build so far, and that is masking. Honestly, I kind of jumped the gun by starting to paint some of the parts before I was truly ready. And that's because if you get this kit, it is going to be at least a week, probably 2 or 3 before you can even get to the fun parts, which I would consider the painting and assembling. Honestly, the most tedious part for me was just prepping all the parts and sanding and getting all the flash off of them. But the masking definitely takes a close second to that first part, and unfortunately these are the 2 parts you have to do before you can even get into painting. Unfortunately, for a lot of the larger parts, they have multiple pieces that on the model should be different colors, but they are molded as one piece, and that means that you have to provide the differentiating point where one color meets another color. I do wish that these were molded in a way where you had each separate part that was different so that you could easily paint them differently. You wouldn't have to mask anything, but for whatever reason that they had to make it this way, they did, and that's fine. It's just going to take you a lot longer to mask all of these different sections, especially the leg portion. This part was also pretty tricky because it's a lot of curves and dome shapes, and those are harder. So basically this was quite tedious because you have to chop your masking tape into tiny little pieces and stuff it in all those little crevices. I did end up recording all of my masking sessions, but I am not going to put you through that because it was literally more than 10 hours of just masking. I really wish they would have molded these leg armor pieces different from like the internal structure and just had them glued on, because that would have made this a lot easier to paint. The legs by far were the most time consuming because you had to use a bunch of tiny little pieces to make sure that every little area that you didn't want painted that color was like, there's just so many overhangs and it's a lot. I actually made the biggest mistake of this project at this point, and that was with the masking, but I will show you what I did later, and yeah, it's pretty bad. These grills were actually not that hard to cut out. I just, again, used a bunch of tiny little strips to make the sections for them, and it wasn't that bad. Another huge mistake I made was painting the gold first, and I can't stress to you how much, if I had done that differently, the outcome and the ease of this project would have been a lot better. Unfortunately, I do think a lot of these problems that I'm having just stem from a lack of experience, and if I was making maybe 3 or 4 or 5 of these kits, by the time I got to the 3rd or 4th one, I think I'd have it down pretty good to where I can make it look at least 80 to 90% of, like, not perfect, but really good. Now that I have most of the gold parts all masked up, it's time to get back to painting. I originally wasn't going to be putting any gold on the armored pieces because I wanted those to have a higher contrast, but I accidentally grabbed the gold on one of the stripes I was laying down and it actually came out pretty cool, so I just ran with that, and I wanted to put another little gold accent on all of the armored pieces. I'm just going to finish up and lay down the base layer on these newer pieces and try to get them to match the older pieces that I had painted previously. And here we are so far with laying down a gradation of 4 different grays for the base coat that I'm going to be laying even more texturing and depth on top of, like you can see in these older pieces with the hex camo and the gold stripes. Also, off camera, I ran a ring of gold around the entire base, and I have an idea for how I want that to look in the final stages of this build. I know that it has a lot of gold going on at this point, but I'm hoping that it's not too overpowering, but I won't really know until I see more of the pieces painted and coming together. I was pretty loose with the camo. I didn't have anything pre-planned out or anything like that. I just wanted to have different variations going on so that it wasn't just one uniform pattern for every piece. At this point, I was actually pretty happy with how the pieces were coming out and looking so far. I really like the contrast with the grays and the gold. Also, the brown metallic and the black matte just really goes well with all the color palette that I have going on here. And as if this kit wasn't already way over the top, I'm taking it to another level with another layer of texturing. So I have 4 layers of gray that are kind of gradating into one another as the base layer. Then I'm throwing on the same grays but alternating where it's landing with the hex pattern. So that's just a whole lot of gray going on. And then on top of that, I'm going to be throwing on some tiger stripes in black. I didn't want these tiger stripes to have a super hard edge, so what I did was just ripped and tore the masking tape so that the edge would be somewhat feathered. This would give these tiger stripes a much softer and organic feel, which would then contrast even more with the hexagonal stencil with really hard edges. So I have this stacking of a soft gray base layer with 4 different grays gradiated into one another. Then I'm throwing on a much harder edged hex pattern with the stencil, and then on top of that I'm throwing back on a softer kind of feathered look of the tiger stripes. So you have this stacking of like soft, hard, soft, and it just brings out a whole new level of dimensionality. Then with the gold, I'm throwing on another hard edge to contrast that soft edge of the tiger stripe because that's going to cover on top of those. You might think this is way too much, and it probably is, but this kit is way over the top and I wanted this paint scheme to be that as well. Okay, are you ready for the biggest failure that I've made so far on this project? Here it is right there. As you can see, the masking tape is literally ripping up the gold paint that I spent so long trying to make at least look half decent. I'm gonna be honest here, this wasn't quite devastating, but this was severely disappointing, especially after I spent so long trying to make this gold look good. Look at that right there, it's just ripping off pieces of it, and the finish underneath just looks terrible. Some pieces, they just totally ripped it down to the resin. Of course, this was so disappointing to see, and I only have myself to blame for it. I guess this is technically a masking error and not a painting error, but I think that old gold still would not stick very well, and I had to lay down so many coats that it's just ripping up the top coats on it, and this happened to just about every piece that I had masked. I don't think this would have been as bad had I just used a fresh can of gold paint, because this was ripping off the old gold paint. I also could have used a masking tape that wasn't quite as sticky, but then my lines wouldn't have been as defined. Of course, the real solution in the hindsight of my experience was to paint the gold last. Do not paint the gold first and mask that. You paint the matte colors and then you mask that. So that was my lesson, and I needed some time to think about how I was going to fix this. I knew I wanted to weather some of the gold parts, and it did help a little bit to kind of cut back on how glaring these mistakes were, but at this point, it just really needed to be redone. Also, things weren't going on for the parts that I had freshly painted either, because again, that old gold paint with all those layers that I put on it, they were making it so even some really heavy duty primer wasn't even sticking to it in parts. This gold paint will not let me live, and it is still haunting me even from under all the other coats of paint. I wasn't going to try and fix this gold any longer, and my only thought was, I'm just taking it back down to nothing and starting fresh. I should have either masked or painted the gold second, and I wouldn't have run into this issue, but since I was basically going to have to redo all the things that I did before, I figured I might as well redo this as well. Was this absolutely the last thing I wanted to do on Earth at this point? Was scrape off all of the paint, all of the gold paint that I had previously put on? Yes, it was. No amount of praying was going to get me out of this mess that I created for myself, so the only way I saw out was back from the beginning. I didn't scrape off everything, but it was a large majority of some of the bigger, more complicated parts. Basically anywhere the gold was that I didn't like, or some very troublesome spots, I took it off, and I scraped it off with a tiny little scraper. I didn't film hardly any of that because it was about 4 hours of just tediously scraping, and yeah, that was super annoying. When I get a time machine, I'm definitely going back and I'm whispering in my own ear and saying, just paint the gold second and buy a fresh can of it. So what do you guys think? Am I in way over my head, as I knew I would be when I started this project? And painting metallic colors is definitely not my strong suit, and I don't know what I'm going to do at this point. I guess I'm just going to have to repaint this model 10 or 100 more times. At some point, I'm going to be scraping away all the atomic structure of this to where there is no model left. The only thing left will be shame and disappointment. Did I potentially damage some of this surface finish? I'd say most likely, because I had to scrape it pretty hard. But most of these pieces are going to be painted in that gray camo, and that will hide a lot of it. Plus, these are more of the armored pieces, and if they have like a scuff or a scrape, it's okay, it's par for course. So that's where I'm at for this one, and I want to thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end and being with me along for this journey that is definitely a train wreck and a disaster. But stay tuned with me for the next one and see if I can dig myself out of this hole that I put myself in. We actually might have done it, and we also might have started to assemble some of the pieces. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.